Let me talk about gross profit margins for a minute, because that's one of the things that makes Big Lots truly unique. Now, a gross profit margin compares a company's sales to what they paid to obtain the things that they're selling. For example, Walmart, their gross profit margin is typically around 24 to 25%, meaning that for every dollar in sales, they're pocketing about 25 cents, or at least are now able to use that 25 cents to pay for advertising or whatever else. I talked about this once before in a video I made about Costco. This is the exact graph I showed, and it was meant to demonstrate how Costco has ridiculously low margins compared to other popular retailers. They make up for it in volume and membership revenue, that's all in the other video, but back to Big Lots. Their gross profit margin is around 40%, which is much higher than anything else on here. On the average sale, they're pocketing much more than these competitors. The reason the margin is so high is because they're buying their inventory for really cheap. Sure, they sell stuff at lower prices than your typical retailer, but they buy their stuff at even lower prices than your typical retailer. Let's look deeper into it. Their entire model is sort of based on imperfection. Hear me out here. Have you ever made pasta, just for the whole family? Adding all the spices, mixing up the sauce, and boiling the noodles? But how do you know how much to make? The more people you're serving, the harder it is to predict. I'd say with anything more than a couple people, it's darn near impossible to make the perfect amount. The worst outcome is that there isn't enough, so you'll make a little extra to be safe. Nothing wrong with eating a little leftover pasta for lunch the next day. Manufacturers and retailers face these decisions all the time when deciding how much of something they should either make or buy. Of course, they can look at market trends and purchase orders and many other things to try to make accurate predictions, but come on now, you're not going to get that perfect. There's always going to be something left over. That's where Big Lots comes in. 3 days after pasta night, they knock on your door and ask if you have any leftover pasta you're willing to part with. Since you're tired of eating it at this point, and we're probably going to throw it away soon anyway, you're willing to sell it to them for really cheap. Then they go and sell it to someone else for more than they paid for it, but still much less than it would have cost to buy some new pasta. Alright, enough of the pasta. It's getting kind of gross. Food isn't the best metaphor here. I just use it because it's the most relatable example of leftover production. In reality, Big Lots isn't buying moldy pasta. They're buying things like summer furniture that went unsold for the season, or toys that were big last year, but now room needs to be made on the shelves for the next big thing. Maybe it's a phone charging cable that now uses updated packaging. It's generally stuff that's perfectly fine, but typically manufacturers and retailers want to keep up with what's current, and anything they have left that's no longer current, they're willing to sell for a low price just to get rid of it. That's probably the biggest reason that these places end up with unwanted inventory, but there's others. Consider liquidations and returns and products being discontinued. Oh, what if you put in way too much garlic for your family's liking and they hardly touch it? Well, Big Lots will take it off your hands and sell it to someone who loves garlic. And I started talking about pasta again, didn't I? Well, anyway, that's the idea behind Big Lots. For whatever reason, you have some pasta that you don't want, or not pasta, a couch. You have a business that makes couches, and you want to get rid of last year's models to make room for this year's. Big Lots is willing to pay you a little something for it and try to find someone who wants it. It's really a cool system because everyone benefits. You just got some money for something you were looking to get rid of. Big Lots just obtained some inventory for a really low price, and whoever they sell it to probably isn't too picky about buying a, slightly outdated couch? And who knows what you'll find at Big Lots. It's fun, right? They do carry some things that you could expect, but who knows what company produced too much of what this week? It's never the same, and that gives reason for the customers to keep checking back. Big Lots is typically labeled as a closeout store, and when we look at the definition of closeout, well, it makes sense. They've actually been pulling away from that model a little bit recently, but it's always been their angle. It started as one location in Columbus, Ohio by a man named Sol Schenk. already using this closeout model, but it actually had a large emphasis on auto parts early on. Auto parts in cars are perfect for this type of business. There's always new parts for new models of cars and a huge push for manufacturers and dealerships to get rid of the old ones. I don't mean to say this in a negative way necessarily, but this guy was like the vulture of the car industry, just waiting for something to die so he can swoop down and take stuff from it. In the 1970s, there was a car company called Bricklin that shut down, and he was there to buy all the remaining parts so he can sell them to all the people who already owned one of their cars. I imagine he was really able to mark up the price of those parts, because if you owned a car from Bricklin, you were kind of at his mercy. In the 1980s, he did the same thing with DeLorean. After they shut down, he just bought up all the remaining parts and even the cars that they had left over and sold them at a profit too. In 1982, he opened the first store that we would recognize as a Big Lots. And then 3 years later, in 1985, they became a public company and used the money they raised to open 40 to 50 new locations. The naming of these stores was very odd. That first location wasn't even called Big Lots, it was called Odd Lots. Then, for reasons I can't say I fully understand, they started opening stores called Big Lots, then later opened stores under the names It's a Deal and All for One. In 1996, they announced that they would close all of their 165 It's a Deal and All for One locations, but then 1 year later, to further complicate things, they spent nearly $1 billion to acquire a West Coast chain of similar stores. Those were called McFrugals, and they were already the owners of a chain called Pick and Save. And despite the naming issue, that was seemingly a good move. Big Lots had been almost entirely on the eastern half of the United States, and this was a perfect opportunity to quickly gain a huge presence in the western half. And to complicate the naming issue one step further, the name of the entire company I've been talking about was Consolidated Stores Corporation. While we're on the topic of acquisitions, I have to mention one other major acquisition that they made right around this time. It was in 1996, 1 year before McFrugals, when they bought KB Toys. They paid $315 million for well over 1,000 stores. See, they'd already dealt with toys in their usual stores for years, just recently acquired a much smaller toy store, and this was their attempt to become a major part of that industry. KB Toys was the second largest toy store at the time, and this was thought to be something really big. We all know which store had the #1 spot, and they were such a giant at the time, everyone else was desperately trying to steal some kind of market share from them. And maybe KB Toys was the one that can do it, since they had an experienced company like this behind them. It really didn't work. As I said, they bought it in 1996 for $315 million, and then spent the next 4 years pouring money into it. For example, $80 million they invested on their website, kbkids.com. Then they ended up selling the company for $300 million 4 years later. Just looking at those facts, I think we can say this was not a smart investment. Some of the reasons stated for the failure were lack of video game sales and oversaturation of the toy market. Maybe in the future we can look more into it, but for today, let's just leave it at that. As you can probably guess, overall, these weren't seen as the best years for Big Lots, and I think we can see why. It wasn't even Big Lots, it was Consolidated Stores Corporation that owned Big Lots and Odd Lots, recently closed It's a Deal and All for One, but added McFrugals and Pick and Save, not to mention they lost a bunch of money during their brief 4-year stay as the nation's second largest toy store. I mean, what are they doing? I see the reasoning for most of these steps along the way, but at a certain point, you have to stop and see that this company is all over the place. Well, they identified their issues and did a good job in fixing them. In the year 2000, when they got rid of KB Toys, that was the start of their plan to start focusing more on Big Lots. Long overdue, they changed the name of everything to Big Lots, spent a bunch of money fixing up their stores, then spent a lot more money in advertising all of the changes. Way more than today. It used to be perceived as more of a second-rate store, you only shop there if you're poor. They didn't want to be perceived as the place you're forced to go to if you don't have any money, but rather the place you could go if you're looking to save money. To attract a higher income crowd, they repainted all the stores, installed better floors, made the lighting brighter, even launched a new and improved company-wide customer service training program. Basically did a bunch of stuff to make the experience more pleasant. And now that all the locations stores went by the same name, they were able to efficiently advertise all of the changes. Instead of relying heavily on these local circulars like they used to, they could now run national TV campaigns. It was an effective rebranding and overall turnaround. As I mentioned before, they've made some recent changes that are intended to further pull themselves away from that bargain hunting perception. Things like sourcing fewer of their items through these closeout methods and increasing planned purchases in order to have more of the same items available for the customers each time they enter the store, along with becoming even more customer focused, just trying to make the experience better in any way they can. I guess you can say sort of a further progression from their earlier transformation. It's definitely in a similar spirit. So it appears they're actually slowly trying to pull away from these methods that have been so successful over the years, but it's still a huge part of how they operate, and it's why they've been so successful overall. Let me know in the comments. What do you think of all this? Did I touch on the main points of why they're successful, or is there more to say? Also, was it silly to operate under different names for so long, or do you see the logic behind it? What about KB Toys? That all seemed like a disaster, but was there any good to pull from it? We touched on a lot of things in this video. That's a big reason I wanted to talk about Big Lots. There's no way you thought I'd be mentioning DeLorean in this video. So any thoughts on any of it, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.